Hello everyone, welcome to a somewhat interesting video, I hope, on my league match which I played today, Saturday. And what I had in way of explanation is that the game was meant to be played on Thursday night along with the rest of my team, but my opponent had work and other commitments, so we scheduled it for Saturday. That meant we already knew the result of the other games in the team, and the team I was playing for was winning the match 2-1. So all I needed was not to lose, and I would get the win for the team. And I was not exactly feeling like playing a very, very long game. Wasn't really in the mood. So this league match is not going to be a very long analysis session. I played c4. He went e6, and I've learned to play knight f3 first instead of knight c3, because after d5 it can get complicated. So here, a line that I have played as white is g3, and after d5, bishop g2. Here, black has essentially two options. Option number one is to capture the pawn, and option 2 is to just complete development with moves like c5 or knight bd7, bishop e7. Sometimes black even goes d4, going into a kind of Benoni type setup, a tempo down, which is a bit interesting. But if they take the pawn, which is certainly a move, you can castle here, but the move that I've been playing a lot is knight to a3, which is, I believe, recommended by Michal Marin in his book on the English opening. And the reason he likes this move is that you want to take on c4 with the knight to increase your central control, rather than doing queen to a4 and then taking, because then the queen can get attacked a lot. And if black plays normal moves like bishop e7, you take on c4 and it's fine. But if black chooses to capture you, you actually take with the pawn. You don't go queen a4 check and then take with the queen, because that wastes too much time. After black castles, I believe the move is queen c2, but I might be wrong. It's something like this. And the whole point of this opening is that if black ever tries b5, you get rid of your doubled a pawns with the move a4. And black, I don't think they can really hold that pawn forever. But white has lots of compensation even if black does end up holding the pawn. So I think, I can't remember the main line here, I think it might be bishop b2 or rook b1. But it's a very interesting position to reach. And that's why I was thinking of this idea. But in the game, I played knight c3 in this position, just to see what they would do. Then d5, and here's the critical moment. If you go g3, then d4 is a really good move, gaining tempo on the knight. And black gets a Benoni with tempi, actually, because you'll have wasted two moves with your knight. That's why, if I go d4 as well, we go into a sort of classic queen's pawn opening with, takes, if they want to do that, and I play e3 and I'm fine. But the thing is, black can do a kind of Tarrasch system, which can be very, very awkward. I say awkward, it's just mainline theory, but black gets a lot of activity in this game, and I didn't really want him having an excuse to play on for a long time. That's why I played a very boring setup with c takes d5. Then, if they take with the knight, I'm pretty happy with this. I can play d4 and e4 later on and get control of the centre. So e takes is the mainline move. d4, there's now a lot fewer options for black. They can't play c5, or they can, but if they do, it will transpose to a Tarrasch where I think bishop g5 is very nice for white. And then if black plays c4, we're in the main line, but it takes a bit of accurate play. But he played c6, which is very reasonable as a move. I came in with bishop g5. We're essentially in almost a Slav type position here. Bishop e7 and e3 to make the pawn chain, in the same way black has. And the idea for white is usually to attack the queen side with minority attacks like a3, b4, b5. Sometimes you can control the centre more solidly with knight to e5 later. along with moving your light squared bishop. So he does bishop f5 to prevent bishop d3, which was my next planned move. And whilst bishop e2 is certainly a move, it's a candidate option, I always feel that's a bit too passive. And bishop d3 is also perfectly fine. But I don't like trading my light squared bishop this early in the game. So I played queen b3 and offered the draw. Because black will probably go queen b6, and I can probably get away with capturing the queen, or I could even play something like bishop e2, and then if they take my queen, I take back. And even though I have doubled isolated pawns, I actually have lots of activity for the position. So he accepted the draw, and it was the end of the match. When I turned on a computer analysis, it said neither of us had made any mistakes. So we had both played perfect. So that was that game. The reason I'm doing this video is not to do this match. It was that afterwards, and after this, it was confirmed that my team had won 2.5, 1.5. I played a couple of blitz games with people in the teams who were playing, and I played blindfolded. Let's have a look and see how well I did. Same opponent, he's 2173, which is a very accurate representation of his strength. 2173 sounds about right. So playing blindfolded against him, he was white, and I played a similar setup with d4, d5, then knight f6, and he's setting up a sort of London system, very inoffensive and solid. I do something similar. Knight f3. If I play knight bd7, we'll have the exact same position, but I choose to play bishop d6. If bishop takes bishop, queen takes, and I have slight lead in development. So bishop g3 is a very sensible plan. The idea is that black eventually will maybe have to take the bishop, and then white takes back with the h-pawn, and essentially develops their rook without even moving it. Castles. c3, so London system is set up. I play a similar move with c6. Queen b3. So here I'm under a little bit of pressure. If I go, say, queen c7 or queen b6, black can take my bishop on d6 and then do queen takes pawn. I did bishop takes pawn here, and we would get a very interesting position which he did not want. If queen takes b7, I was looking at the move bishop takes f2 check, following up with king takes f2, and I actually thought I might have something here. First I could go knight bd7, and if black chooses to capture the pawn, which is certainly a candidate move, I thought I had knight g4 check, and the king will go to e2 to prevent the e3 pawn being taken. This is the kind of position I really like. Even though I'm one pawn down, it's not easy at all for for white to defend this and not be a bit worse. So a computer will probably say white's a bit better, but no, it loves black. My instinct is right, and that black is definitely the one with the initiative. Okay, I was going to play knight df6. Queen b8 is not the move I would have found in the game, so I'll be honest. And yeah, h3 makes sense. And I was looking at knight takes pawn, but that is not the move. Queen b8 again, with a and bishop d3. Bishop d3 is probably something I'd have found a lot faster than knight to h6. So here, if king takes bishop, knight f2 check, winning the rook. So king has to move, and then knight takes e3 might be good here. After, say, the bishop moves. So bishop takes f1. If pawn takes knight, I can take on g2. So knight takes f1 will keep the e3 pawn on the board. Yeah, and this just looks nice for black. You know, white is very tied up, and black can easily get some compensation here. And if white does a move like g4, a bit like in a Sicilian, I can easily play knight to e4, and I dominate the knights. Yeah, this is looking very, very nice for black. So in the game, he did the more simple move. After I took the bishop, he took with the h-pawn. I played queen b6, essentially trying to trade off all the pieces so that my blindfold ability is increased the more pieces are traded. He obliged by not getting out the way, which is absolutely fine. This is probably the correct way to play for white. And I finish off development with knight b d7, b4. White's trying to get the minority attack, or sort of, with b5. It's also to get rid of the doubled pawns. So a6, preventing b5. Knight b3, so white is clamping down on the dark squares, trying to play knight c5, getting initiative. I'm fine with that move, because after knight c5, which is what he played, I traded again, and I've got some slight weaknesses on b7. However, I don't think that this is the end of the world. I think that black is perfectly okay here. And again, I wish to trade. He castled, which I think might be a bit inaccurate, because the rook on h1 can be very nice on the h-file. I think maybe white should play maybe knight d2 as a move, but then I guess they would lose the g-pawn. So it's not obvious what they do. I took, and again I wanted to trade pieces. My idea was to play knight d2, which would force the bishop off the board. Bishop e2 was chosen, and I now played f5, a bit like a Stonewall Dutch. Got a very, very solid pawn structure here. Bishop d3, rook f6. I chose to do a rook lift, fighting on the king side. He did rook a3. I swung across with my rook, and he then dropped back. I wasn't certain if he had reconsidered his options, or felt like this was just an attempt to confuse me and make the position in my head harder to work out. Either way, I decide to gain control of the h-file. My plan is to just put both rooks on the h-file and play rook h1 mate. But he took, and take with the f-pawn is probably correct. And I think here, after f3, I don't think I should trade. I possibly should just play rook f6 and allow my pawns to be doubled. But black is meant to be sort of okay. Yeah, my instinct here is rook hf6, but in my head, for whatever reason, I thought that if white took the pawn on e4, then the white would be better, but I'm wrong. So my head wasn't the best place to analyze this position. So if white takes, what I can do is trade everything. And when I was considering this option in the game at the time, I thought that my pawns would be very weak on e4 and e6, but it's very hard for white to actually get the king over there. And my main weakness is actually the pawn on b7. So the computer likes white now. It's possible that this is still okay for white, because, yeah, king f2 looks right, or g4, preventing me going h5. Yeah, king g6, king f2, I don't know, maybe king g5, king g3, and I suppose white always has the tempo with c4 as a move. Yeah, and if I ever put pawn g5, then I don't really see why. Okay, so why not g5? Is this not drawing? If I've given up all hope of winning the game, white can just sort of hang around a bit. And I don't really see what they do, because I suppose the only option for white is to play d5 or b5 in the future. So if I run my king over here, and white plays c4, let's say, and I keep running my king over, and white brings their king over. The big question is, does white win this? So king c3, and assuming I don't do anything on the king side, and I just move the king in the center of the board, d5 doesn't look like it's not coming up on the top few moves, because d5 takes, and I should be okay in this line. And yeah, the position is just completely level, because if they can't go d5, the only other option is b5, because oh, I have b5 check. That is not what I was intending to play. Wow, b5 check. That is not the move I had thought of, but it makes sense. If I go king b8, then king a5, king like a7, then b5 is quite good for white. So b5 is a very nice move. If king a5, I take the pawn. So white has to take en passant. I take with the king, and there's no entry point for the white king. I can play, like, yeah, king c7, king a7 or something. Yeah, and all I do is just walk around with the king. The moment they play king a4, I play king b6. Sort of corresponding squares. And yeah, the moment white plays something like c5, I just drop back. Again, there's no entry point for white, so it's a draw with accurate play. But I took the pawn, which must be incorrect here, because white undoubles the pawns. And I played g5, trying to prevent white playing f4, but the big problem is my e6 pawn. So I had thought I would be fine after rook h4, king g2, and possibly I should do rook f6, but I wanted to play e5 fairly soon, so I played king g7 and traded rooks in order to play h6. And I was fairly certain there was no infiltration point on the h-file. That meant I could play rook e8 more easily. And the move I was most scared of was f4 from white. I don't know whether that is the best move, but almost everything is +1. I think f4 is the best move, at least the moves that makes it scary for me. I would guess I'd have to... I mean, if I take the pawn, that must be awful, because white can take with the e-pawn and then clamp down forever on those squares. Rook f8, and again, there's not really a good way for white to improve the position. Rook f1, I might be able to go king g6. Pawn f5, I could always take it. Yeah, I can simply play rook f7, rook f8, and oscillate back and forth with the rook. White's best options are to move the rook around in circles. And if they try rook a, this is probably the best plan. Rook a3. Again, I just keep moving up and down. Then rook a3. It's just level. h5 is a fairly good move. Yeah, h5 and a bunch of pawn trades occur. And even though white does target my weak b-pawn, it's not really that weak. It's very, very solid with my rook over here. So that means I can play e5 coming up in the next move or two. So I'm assuming I can play e5. And yeah, the position is about level. It's more or less a draw. However, white's doubled and isolated pawn make it a little bit tricky to play. Just a little bit. Anyway, rook e1 was chosen, not f4. That allowed me to play e5, and then my opponent played e4, which is very complicated to analyse. Lots of captures and pins and everything in this line. In the end I did e takes d4, which may not be correct. But I didn't like the idea of king f6, which may be better for me. It's still good for white though. And actually, to be fair, the top three moves are all about the same. E takes d4, d takes e4, and king f6. Although king f6 is starting to become the best move. Though e takes d4 is very close to it. It's 0.7 and 0.8. E takes, c takes. Then my idea was that white couldn't move the e-pawn off the e-file. So after king g6 and e5, I can blockade the pawn. I played h5, and white took, which is correct. King takes. Threw in a check. I came back. f4 was chosen. I took it, and the king captured. My plan was rook f8, forcing a check. And yeah, king e3 is, like he said after the game, that king e3 was what he thought the only way to even try to win this game. But still very complicated, and it's not looking too easy, as it's only plus 0.5. King g3 was chosen, and I simply played rook back to e8. And we may end up with a similar position. Rook to f1 or king to f4 are both about the same, but king f4 I do the same line. Yeah, and rook f1 I can play king g5 and gain a bit of initiative, gain a bit of space. And it's still not that easy. I had rook e7 as well. So overall, not a bad game. I'm not too upset with the draw. And as it was blindfold chess, it's not a bad result. Both down to a minute as well. I doubt we would play too accurately from this position. The second game was played against a teammate of mine, and he is a lot better than 1500. He's about 2000 on his FIDE or standard rating. And as it was a blitz game with me being blindfolded, neither one of us is playing at exactly our best in blitz. I played in English and did the usual fianchetto on the king side. He has chosen a more aggressive Dutch type setup with e5 and f5. The thing with the English is that even though you don't have any sort of weaknesses as much as if you've done d4 and c4, in that you're able to control the e4 square more easily with d3, black is allowed to play this sort of classical Dutch setup with e5 and f5, which is not normally allowed to black. So the position is more or less equal, which in the English you shouldn't really be too unhappy with an equal position. Your aim in the English opening is not to crush your opponent in the first 10 moves or 20 moves. It's to simply build up a nice position without any real weaknesses, and to essentially plan lots of complex maneuvers and strategies to slowly, build up an attack over time. So having an objectively equal position is not too bad for white. He's played bishop b4 and then put his bishop outside the pawn chain, as d6 has happened. I now play knight d5, again simply trying to trade as many pieces as I can to get me into a good position, and bishops are traded. Then I trade knights and trade another piece. So it's a little tongue-in-cheek. I would never play like this in a regular game, as he now has a good bishop and I don't. And knight f3, for whatever reason, I was scared of e4 and maybe him hacking on the king side. That is why I chose to go queen side and then play knight f3, with my queen defending b2. e4 was chosen, and possibly I should take, but I was worried about f takes. I move the knight to maybe d4, and then f2 drops. And I felt like I could play it cautiously with knight to e1. Bishop e6. Now, here's a little activity. Try to find one of the worst moves white can make on the board. I believe there's 6 of them, so you have more chances than most to get it wrong, or to get it right, rather. Basically, if you move the queen away from defending b2, then you get mated. But that's something most players wouldn't do. They wouldn't play like queen f4 or queen a5 and get mated. The move a lot of players would do, which could get them mated, is to move the knight. Move the knight to c2, because you may think you're developing the piece and you're maybe able to play d4 later. But this move would also allow queen takes b2 mate. That's why I played queen c3, and again I want to trade pieces. He did not. Now I get knight c2. And black chose c5 to lock in my knight on the dark squares. The slight trouble with this is that I have knight to e3 and then d5 in the future. Rook b7, very good move from black, thinking how to improve his pieces. And the obvious move is to then double up the rooks. Although perhaps rook to b6 is a little bit more effective. b3 and rook fb8. If black can play the move a5, a4, then it could potentially be useful. Now here, we're in an interesting setup. How would you improve the prospects for white? What to do here? Right, so I had 3 main ideas. The only piece that I'm actually happy with is my queen at the moment. It's guarding a lot of stuff near my king. It's very active on c3, controlling the centre of the board. And my king is not exactly ideal, but it's relatively okay. I don't really like the idea of running the king all the way to g1 to try and escape. I think it's better to move the other pieces. So the three things I want to do, one is maybe move the rook to d2 as a safety strat. There's also rook to g1, trying to play g4. And finally, the move I did in the game was I wanted the knight and bishop off the board. So my plan was to trade like this. If I turn on the computer, it's starting to appreciate that black has the better prospects right now. They've got more active pieces. But I feel the position is what they call trending in white's favour. Over the next few moves, my pieces will be improved. Black doesn't really have good ways of making their pieces any better right now, apart from moves like king h8 or h6 to make their king stronger. Yeah, and rook hg1 is a candidate move. h4 is a move I had looked at to prevent black gaining any more space. And the move d4 to open up the d-file for my rook. My move knight g2 is probably not... Oh, I played rook d2 first. And then c6 to prevent knight d5. Yeah, so knight g2 is actually one of the main candidate moves, but it is significantly worse than pawn takes pawn, which for some reason I thought that white would have not enough in compensation after a bunch of trades, and then the pawns go flying all over the place. Knight g2 is not so good. d5 knight f4. Yeah, g5 is what I had thought may happen. And bishop d7, I was not too unhappy with that. I could play h4 and hold down everything. He played takes in the game, which felt very strange. And my move here is possibly very, very bad. d takes c4 is the correct line. And I open up the rook and can play rook hd1. Clearly the best option. In the game, I took, because my thinking at the time was that after queen takes, I could then trade queens as well. And if he takes, d takes, and I'm fine. And if rook e7 or some other move like it, I can always play moves like rook c2 or pawn takes pawn or queen takes queen. And then these doubled isolated pawns could be very bad for black. So we may end up in this sort of position with rook c2. Either way, it's nice for white. It's not winning, but it's definitely pleasant. He did c takes though, which felt very wrong, trying to gain initiative on me. And if I take the pawn, then he can take back up with the rook if he needs to, or take my knight and be a pawn up. I think my move is correct. Yes, and it's I think the only move. Queen e5 is one of those incredibly complex moves which to me doesn't look at all appealing. Knight takes c5 was my only option to gain an advantage. Then if b2 check, I can simply play king b1 and I have escaped. B takes a2 was the move, defended by his queen. I took the rook, no fear. Then queen takes, and can you see what I played, which may be the only move to keep me in the game. Alright, well, if you said rook takes a2, I mean, maybe you're okay here as well, because you are a rook up at the moment, and therefore, by losing a rook straight back, we're actually in a position which might be classified as equal in terms of material. However, I mean, black is one pawn up. They've got the passed a pawn, and definitely, it's definitely the case that the white king is less safe than the black king. I would be very hesitant to play this line. The move I played is queen c4 check, which I believe is now winning for white, and I am right. So when we're in this position, knight takes b7 again was the only move. Yeah, queen takes again is probably the best option. Okay, and rook d to d1 is also apparently just about okay. But again, it looks very complex because of queen b1 checks and all the rest of it. But queen c4 is the clearly best move. He's king h8, and then I can do, yes, the only move, queen takes a2, preventing all the tactics. And my only point where I made a slight error in my visualization was after e takes d3. I was about 50-50 whether their pawn was on c6 or c7. So if I take the pawn on d3 with my rook, or even my pawn, there's a 50% chance that's the best move, but there's also a 50% chance I'm completely lost after queen takes h1 if their pawn was adjusted to c7. So the pawn was there instead. Queen takes h1 would be a move. And as I'm a rook up, I was aware that I don't need to do anything too special to win the match. Simple rook hd1 is therefore a good safety move. And if white does pawn takes pawn, black does pawn takes pawn, what would you do as white? Yeah, I'm sure you saw it. Very good. Pawn takes pawn, rook d8. Simple win. Back rank, checkmate. He played h6 to prevent this plan. And again, I probably should take the pawn. I thought that rook takes was best. I can't resist an opportunity to trade, though. And if he moves the queen, I will trade on b8, then take the pawn. He did d takes instead. That's a sort of almost a joke move. I took the queen. He made a new queen. I took, and here he resigned. I'm sure that the position is about +5. Well, okay, maybe not. +4. But I think he knew that queen a6 might be very strong to win the pawns anyway. In rook c7, I can easily pick off a few pawns or just play relatively good moves and I'll win. So like rook d7 might be correct. So king e2. The only thing I have to avoid is him having his pawns quite far up the board. So for something like rook e7, I can play king f3, get out of all the checks. And his f pawn's attacked, his a pawn's attacked. If something like rook f7, I'd be fairly happy with queen c5, and he can't defend all the pawns. One of them will go. Something like king h7 to prevent lots and lots of checks. And again, if I can pick off one or two pawns, I should win. Although blindfolded, it wouldn't be the easiest task to win this. The downside was that the game was, I think, 5 minutes plus 3 seconds a move, and he was down to about a minute, I think, at the end of the match. Oh, less than that, 36 seconds. I had 3.5 minutes. If anyone would make a big mistake there, it would be him. And it's pretty much lost. Like, you can try making fortresses and things as black, but you're going to have a very hard time making the fortresses. So overall, not a bad time to resign the match. And it's possible that I made a mistake in that I gave black the slight chance of making something here. So yeah, d takes e2. I think I do have to take the queen, or yeah, rook takes e2 is apparently a bit better. It's a very rare occasion when you don't want to take a queen, because I lose 2 rooks for the queen. Instead, rook takes e2, and I'm just simply a rook up, which would make things easier. So yeah, minor mistake by me, but it didn't really matter too much. I was still winning. Alright, so those were my matches today. 2 blindfold games, win and a draw, and then a very quick draw in my actual official league match. I hope you found this video interesting, and I'll see you next time. Bye.